Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's programme, a fragile ceasefire between Iran and Israel is brokered, which President Donald Trump hopes will draw a line under their 12-day war. But with both sides accusing each other of violations, we ask, will that ceasefire hold? And what happens next to ensure further de-escalation? Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran, following on from the 12-day war between the two countries. Well, the US President Donald Trump, who was the first to declare that ceasefire, has warned both countries against any breaches of the deal that he helped to broker. Well, each side has accused the other of violations, but speaking to reporters at the White House before departing for the NATO summit at The Hague, a visibly irritated President Trump expressed disappointment at both countries for these reported violations.
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I've never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because the one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that.
President Trump speaking there. Well, that 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel also saw American involvement with strikes carried out during the course of the weekend on Iranian nuclear facilities. Well, US B-2 stealth jets used massive bunker-busting bombs in a bid to destroy Iran's underground uranium enrichment sites. Well, in response to that involvement, Iran last night launched a barrage of missiles at the largest US military facility in the Middle East, that is the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Well, there are no reported casualties from Monday's unprecedented attack, which Tehran stressed was not against Qatar, but that it was an act, it said, of self-defense. Of more, we can speak now to Major General Chip Chapman, security and military expert and former head of British counter-terrorism. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure talking to you. I want to start by asking you about where things stand right now. Obviously, this ceasefire is still quite fresh. And I just wondered whether it's normal, whether it's to be expected that there would be some violations within the first couple of hours of a truce being announced. And does that usually happen as two warring parties down their weapons?
Well, in this case, in the dying embers of conflict, when there's often a slip between the cup and the lip, and from an Iranian perspective, because a lot of their command and control and commanders have been hit in the ensuing 12 days, that slip between the cup and the lip may have meant that the communications and down the chain of command just didn't work as expected. That's why often you get a time frame which is not the one you want. It's also Israeli doctrine, of course, to retaliate a disproportionate retaliation in accordance with the Da'a doctrine, should that occur. And it seems that was the thing that was ratcheted back by President Trump. So I do think this ceasefire will hold. I do think that's the end of this conflict. But the key thing is the object of war is a better peace, but from whose perspective and whose rules will apply in the future. So is this just a round, and that in the future, in terms of future timeframes, there'll be another round, because this is really just conflict termination. It is not conflict resolution. Okay, so you're saying that the ceasefire to end the 12-day war is likely to hold, but who knows what happens after that? I mean, what are your thoughts? Well, the first thing is I always thought this would not go on that long, because having war gamed this a number of times, the bar for the Iranians has always been pretty low. The first requirement of the Iranian regime is always regime survival. The second one is domestic security. So if those are fractured or under pressure, they will always try and have some amelioration for the regime. And that is what they've done here. And therefore, I think the first couple of things that will happen from an Iranian regime perspective is the first priority really will be their counterintelligence priority, because it seems that they've been massively penetrated by Mossad and by people who work for Mossad in terms of the exquisite intelligence that the Iranians seem to have. The second thing from a purely military perspective is they need to look at their future air defense posture. And the third one is the real big question is Israel often does warfare as war. That is, because they're a small country, they have to take military action which seems appropriate at the time, but that doesn't bring about the political solution, which is what wars are all about. Wars are, policy by other means, the military means of trying to achieve that. So the real outcome of this, if it were to be really successful, would be to convince Iran to reconsider the viability of a future nuclear program. The real perspective of the US would be, Trump's notion this morning about peace and harmony. For that to happen, of course, you would have to have everyone drinking from the common well of the Abrahamic religions. Now, at the moment, the sort of theocratic regime in Iran has an explicit doctrine of confrontation with Israel and the West. And indeed, one of the other dying embers things, of course, that the Israelis did yesterday was bomb the destruction clock in Palestine Square in Tehran, currently set for 2040, and symbolically bomb the gates of the Evin prison, again, a sort of open the gates for the population to overthrow their regime should they do that. There has not been an explicit doctrine, certainly from Donald Trump, of regime change. There may be centrifugal forces which do lead to regime collapse. So I think, again, one thing to look for in the next few weeks is how regime repression takes place. And again, another indicator and warning of that is how much internet access digital access will the Iranians let people have. It was down to 5% during the 12 days. If they feel they're threatened still in the next week or 2 weeks, they'll keep that connectivity low so the information flows amongst the population will not be great.
Sure. I mean, just sort of listening to you and thinking back on these last 12 days, I mean, events have moved incredibly fast. Even the last 24 hours, we had that long-awaited Iranian retaliation on US interests. And we've had the US ceasefire deal. I mean, clearly we're in a very unpredictable chapter right now. But let's sort of go back a couple of steps. I mean, how did a strike by Iran on US interests in this region lead to such a rapid de-escalation, do you think?
Well, actually, I think that was part of the choreography of this, because one of the things that has been evident in Iranian doctrine, again, since the revolution, is that they've always had to drink from the chalice of poison when they're threatened. They did that in 1980, and they did that in 1988 indirectly when they had to end the Iran-Iraq war. But part of the catalyst for that was the American Operation Praying Mantis, which just about destroyed the Iranian fleet after the Iranians were going to lay some mines, which nearly blew up a American destroyer. So there's always been this notion of drinking from the chalice of poison. The key thing from the Supreme Leader's side, therefore, has been what is the survival defiance spectrum? And of course, it seems to have gone down to the survival side at the moment rather than the defiance. It's also part of Iranian doctrine that retaliation should be deemed to be legitimate and proportionate and should be accepted by the West, or the Americans in this case. That is why it satisfies Persian honor and why it was choreographed and therefore was not to be high casualty, in the same way that they did the same approach in 2020 on a couple of bases in Iraq after the killing of Soleimani under Trump's first regime.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of days ago, there was a lot of worry that this was going to broaden, that the conflict could, bring in other players. I mean, there was even talk about the UK, your country, getting involved in this conflict. I mean, one of the things that some people might find quite surprising, I don't know what your thoughts are, no country seemed to come to Iran's aid. Did that surprise you?
Not really. The cavalry came over the hill for the Israelis and the Americans using the GBU-57 bombs on the Fodor. But it's always been the case, firstly, in the Middle East, of course, because Iran is largely a Shia pariah. They have no friends in the largely Sunni GCC region. And secondly, because although there was an agreement sort of 6 months ago with the Russians, it is a sort of fraternity type agreement. It is not a treaty agreement in that we will aid you in times of war. So though there's sort of an authoritarian axis in conceptual terms, and of course, Shahed 136s are provided by Iran to the Russians. The Russians, for example, have enough on their plate with Ukraine and don't want to disturb the imbalance with the US over Ukraine. And China really has two functions here. Firstly, it is a sort of soft superpower, or approaching that, but it doesn't want to get in hard power in the way that the Americans do. And secondly, of course, it needs the continued oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So it was never going to support Iran in going to its sort of right of arc option of closing the Strait of Hormuz.
We're coming to the end. I mean, are you satisfied that Iran's nuclear program has been more or less paralyzed, or would you say that it's simply been delayed?
Well, I think you need to firstly establish what battlefield damage assessment would tell you. The second thing you'd need to know is whether there was a part of a covert program within this. So one of the indicators of that, of course, is that Iran is still a part of the non-proliferation treaty. So the IAEA inspectors should come in. If they are not allowed to do that, and Iran pulls out of the NPT, then you could say that Iran is still at some time going to go for a dash for a bomb. And that is really what is the short-term paradox wrapped in the long-term paradox. Short-term paradox, you may have paralyzed their nuclear program at the moment. The long-term paradox is they still might go to it, particularly if you still had this type of regime in power in the future.
And just lastly, President Trump due to arrive at The Hague fairly shortly for the NATO summit. I'm assuming he arrives, I'd love to get your opinion, with his head held high, looking like he's emerged from all of this victorious, despite some of his own party members telling him not to act the way he did.
Well, the thing that Trump has been consistent with is particularly, he said this about Ukraine as well, that he doesn't think in terms of winning or losing. He thinks in terms of stopping the killing. He looks at things through a humanitarian peace prism. That is not necessarily the same as a just peace or a better peace, but that's the way he looks at it. But I think he can go with his head held high. He's played a sort of hand of cards, which seems to have come up with a royal flush at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you speaking to us, Major General Chip Chapman. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Michael Oren, who is a historian, a former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and a former member of the Knesset. He joins us from Tel Aviv. Ambassador Oren, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. First of all, I just want to start by asking you, because on Saturday you gave an interview in which you said that your gut feeling was that the United States would become involved in the Israel-Iran war, which it did within a matter of hours of you making that comment, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But do you think that brief US involvement with the bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites is really what drew a line under that 12-day war?
First of all, good to be with you, and thank you for complimenting my gut. It's good to know that sometimes it's accurate. It was a decisive move. Israel, over the course of many weeks, could have achieved the same thing with successive bombing raids against Fordo, Isfahan, and the Natanz facility, perhaps even with ground forces, with special forces. But there's also a tremendous symbolic weight to the president's decision. It sent an unequivocal message of America's commitment to Israel's security, America's commitment to the security of the Gulf. It sent a very powerful message to America's adversaries in the world. I would imagine that there were people in Beijing today who are saying, well, maybe we have to think twice before we attack Taiwan. Russia also took a step backward after President Trump gave the order to bomb Fordo. So in many ways, that action not only changed the balance of power in our region, it had global ramifications geopolitically.
Why were you so sure that President Trump was going to do what he did right then and not use those full 2 weeks that he said he might use to think about it. And then at the end of it, he could have simply got cold feet and said, we're going to do nothing.
I don't have a terrific answer because, in fact, if you look at the sort of the cold facts, they would seem to strongly militate against a decision by the president to act. The polls taken that week showed that close to 90% of the American public was against American military involvement against Iran. And you know about there were divisions within the White House, between the divisions within the MAGA movement, and isolationist part of that movement was very much against military involvement by the United States in Iran. And so the president really went against the odds, went against public opinion in a very major way. But at the end of the day, I think the president saw an opportunity. He likes winners. Israel was emphatically winning. He saw an opportunity to put an end to the war through American intervention. And look, it succeeded. Right now, we've got a ceasefire. The big question is what happens next and what's going to be America's position if and when the Iranian regime comes back to the negotiating table.
Okay, well, let's talk about that a little further and bring into the fact that you've got this track record we've established for making accurate predictions. Are you confident that this ceasefire deal that was announced in the early hours of this morning, are you confident it's going to hold?
It depends on how you define hold. I'm sure that Iran will try to cheat, just like Hezbollah tries to cheat almost every day. And the Israeli military has to respond to those attempts and remind Hezbollah that we're watching very carefully. Now, Iran will try to cheat in various ways, and Israel will want to respond. The question is how much leeway will be given by the United States. We saw what happened today when we tried to respond to an Iranian missile attack on our southern city of Beersheba that killed 5 people. When Israeli jets took to the air, Donald Trump said, basically called them off and used some very harsh language in discussing Israeli decision-making. So we don't know. We don't know what our leeway is going to be, and we don't know what the red lines are. For example, the Iranian regime this morning declared victory and said they're going to start rebuilding the nuclear sites that had been damaged and start replenishing their missile arsenal. Will that constitute, in the eyes of the United States, a violation of the ceasefire? Is it a ceasefire in place? And such a notion exists in international law, in situ. But will that be the case? If not, will Iran be able to rebuild its military capabilities under the shield of a ceasefire? And that would be very difficult. It's a very similar situation that we face in Gaza with Hamas, that Hamas will use a ceasefire to rearm and reorganize, and Israel will have to pay a big price for that in the fast. It's one of the arguments used against those people who are against a ceasefire. And so that is yet to be seen. If, and this is a big if the situation is navigated successfully by the United States, what has transpired over the last 12 days can really be a transformative moment for the entire Middle East. The independence of Lebanon will be guaranteed. The independence of Syria will be guaranteed. A solution to Gaza can be found on the basis of demilitarizing the Gaza Strip and releasing all of Israel's hostages. Who knows, maybe in the future, under a different government, Iran will make peace with Israel. We will have a profoundly different Middle East. Or we could go back to a situation which is not all that different than what existed before October 7th, 2023, where Iran's nuclear capabilities will be capped, will be limited but not eliminated, and Iran will get sanctions relief and will use that money to reestablish its terrorist proxies and reclaim Syria as a colony.
You mentioned a change of government in Iran as being a possible outcome later on down the line. I mean, how vulnerable would you say the leadership in Iran is looking right now, and how likely do you think it is that there will be a change of leadership?
Well, I don't think it's going to be very likely in the short term. I don't know the degree to which opposition in Iran, and there is opposition in Iran, whether it's organized, whether in the current situation where many hundreds of thousands of people have fled from cities, certainly from Tehran, where there's no internet, whether such organization is possible. It is possible that a serious opposition can be mounted within the leadership as well, by elements within the IRGC, within the army, certainly. The army doesn't like the IRGC. It's a very weak army, however. We don't know. What is true, and I think that this would be hard to gainsay this, is that the weakness of the regime has been fully exposed. It has lost its proxies in Hamas and Hezbollah. It doesn't have the ring of fire anymore. It has been proven to be not just a paper tiger, kind of a tissue tiger. And Israel has also struck down some of the tools of oppression in Iran. It has bombed the entrance to the Evin prison, where political prisoners have been held and tortured. I know some of them personally. And it has bombed the headquarters of the Basij, which is the paramilitary group that is used to suppress opposition very, very brutally. So I think that maybe people in the street, I don't know if they love the state of Israel and love what America and Israel have done in terms of bombing Iran, but it doesn't mean that they love the regime either, and may not take steps to remove what has been now for decades a deeply corrupt, inefficient, wasteful regime that has spent countless billions of dollars building terrorist organizations, building nuclear facilities, and not spending that money on the people of Iran, on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure.
Just going back to the conflict, the 12-day conflict, I mean, what do you think would have happened had the US not got involved when they did? I mean, suffice to say, I mean, how much longer would it have dragged on for had President Trump not decided to take action on Saturday?
I think it would have dragged on for weeks. And then we were already into what I would call a war of attrition, not just between two militaries, but between two societies. And which one would surrender first? Now, we were causing significant damage to Iran, breakdown of electricity, breakdown of finances, banks, again, hundreds of thousands of people leaving their homes. But within Israel, we had no school. The economy was paralyzed. There was no travel. There were upwards of 150,000 Israelis who were stranded overseas. One of them being my son was stranded overseas. And that was also exacting a price, as were the daily rocket attacks, the missile attacks. And I'll tell you now, as someone I have children and grandchildren, going into these bomb shelters 1, 2, 3 times a day and night, and the building would shake with these explosions. It was extremely, extremely distressing. So it was a question of how long our society could hold out, how long their society could hold out, which would be the first to raise a white flag and say, okay, we're ready to go back to the negotiating table. And what the American intervention did was to break the cycle of the attrition and come in and really make basically a sea change in the struggle. Now, I have cautioned on Israeli media, I do a lot of Israeli commentary, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. That when the president makes that decision, he's going to come and make demands of the state of Israel. And
what sorts of demands? What sorts of demands, Ambassador, do you think he will be making?
One was that we, for example, when Iran fires a ballistic missile at Beersheba and kills 5 people, we're not going to go back and stage a major bombing reprisal against Iran. In the end, we took out a small radar installation, but it could have been much bigger. But I think down the line, the president, I think, here's a gut feeling. You want to hear a gut feeling? I think the president will revive his deal of the century, his two-state solution deal. Which didn't succeed back when he tabled back in 2019. And full disclosure, I was one of the advisors on that program. And I've been predicting for a long time that it would come back. We haven't seen the last of it. And unfortunately, the Palestinians didn't discuss it. I think maybe this time they'll think a little bit differently about it. And that's going to put some serious challenges to the Israeli government, certainly the current Israeli government, which is quite right-wing, as you know. So we shall see. It is not the last we have heard or seen of Donald Trump, not just militarily, but diplomatically.
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, we're giving credit to Mr. Trump for being a catalyst for bringing about a swift conclusion to the 12-day war. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm sort of getting the sense, not just from talking to you, but from talking to other people in Israel as well, that perhaps there was appetite for more fight, for more to be done, for more to, more striking while the iron was hot, so to speak. Do you think there is an element in Israel that feels like there was still a lot of work to be done, and this is a job not entirely finished?
Well, I think the prime minister came out and said that the IDF had achieved almost all of its military objectives. It's the way he could maybe signal that he doesn't want to continue. But I think the big proof is what happens next. And I'm reiterating what I said earlier, is that if Iran now moves to rebuild its capabilities, if it violates the ceasefire, what will be the response of Israel? What would be the response that the United States will allow Israel to have? And will ultimately the United States act as well?
We heard from the US president, and we didn't broadcast those exact comments, but he did make some pretty strong comments earlier on today as he boarded the plane for Europe for the NATO summit, using some strong language. It sounds like, he's losing patience. Sounds like he's taking all of this very personally, and it has been a personal risk to him because he went against quite a lot of elements in his own party by deciding to get involved. Do you think patience is somehow running out with Prime Minister Netanyahu as well?
And maybe his patience is running out with the Middle East in general. He seems to I don't want to quote him, but to sort of paraphrase him, he said that these two countries have been fighting for a long time and they don't know what they're doing, and he used an expletive in the middle of it, probably the first time ever publicly by a president. Israelis going to listen to that and say that's not fair. We didn't attack Iran in 1979; they attacked us. They wanted to wipe us off the map. We didn't want to wipe them off the map. We're just defending ourselves, and we're not enthusiastic about the moral equivalency of it all. At the end of the day, we're just trying to live here. We're not trying to destroy them. It's not symmetrical. It is very asymmetrical. And if Iran can have any regime it wants, it can be a theocracy, it can be an autocracy, it can be a monarchy, it can be a democracy, as long as they're just not trying to harm us or trying to get proxies to harm us. And I don't know. That understanding is very rare. I do a lot of American television as well, and all the time you hear, Iran and Israel have been fighting for decades. No, we haven't been fighting for decades. Iran has been trying to destroy us for decades. We've been defending ourselves for decades. It's very different, and it's a substantive difference. And in that difference lies the key to what can happen next. Because if Iran stops threatening Israel and other neighbors, and if Iran stops being the world's largest state sponsor of terror in the world, complicit in the murder of hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East, just 500,000 Syrians, thousands of Americans starting in Beirut in 1983 and through the Iraq War, responsible for attempts to assassinate American leaders. They tried to assassinate me when I was in Washington. This is a very evil regime. If that can end, the Middle East can enjoy, I think, an unprecedented era of peace.
Just pivoting to Gaza, I did say we were going to bring it up as the conversation went on. We've got 2 million people suffering in famine-like conditions there in Gaza. The opposition leader Yair Lapid saying this has got to come to an end. Using your powers of prediction, how much longer can this go on for?
Not very much longer. Not very much longer. And it's very divisive in Israeli society right now. It's certainly causing major damage to our international relations. But the question is how it ends. And I think the majority of Israelis would agree to a prolonged ceasefire in exchange for releasing the hostages. Now, I'm not naive. I don't think that Hamas is going to release all the hostages. They read the Israeli press, they read our WhatsApps, and we always say, let us release the hostages, and then we'll go back and we'll eliminate them. They'll always keep a couple of hostages for safekeeping. But we can get most of the hostages out, certainly the living hostages out, for prolonged ceasefire. The big issue for this Israeli government, I stress this Israeli government, is whether at the end of the ceasefire, Israel will retain the right to renew the fighting. Because what's at stake here is whether Hamas will emerge from the tunnels and once again take control of the Gaza Strip. It will rearm and it will stage another October 7th, because that's what its leadership say they're going to do. They actually hide it. They said they're going to do it 10,000 times. If that's the case, that not only will Israelis not go back to living in the areas around the border, I don't know if you have children, but you wouldn't put them there either. They're actually firing rockets again this week. It barely made the news. But it will send a very powerful message of Israeli weakness and Hamas strength around the Middle East. Around the Middle East. It will, not just the Middle East. Hamas is a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, according to a secret report that was leaked from the French government, the Muslim Brotherhood has established a state within France. Hamas wins in Gaza. You're going to see repercussions for that in the streets of Paris. And so the issues here are very serious. And so as a person who, I don't represent the government, I very much want to see that ceasefire. I very much want to see our hostages released. It's crucial for me personally, morally, every way. But I think we have to have an answer about what is the future of Gaza. Will it be demilitarized? Will the leadership of Hamas be exiled to another country? These are crucial questions. Then how do we rebuild the Gaza Strip? Is it an international force, inter-Arab force from the Gulf? Certainly. And how do we re-educate Palestinian young people that in a way that for peace and not for bloodshed and not for terror?
Yeah, but I mean, in the immediate term, I mean, there are horrific scenes playing out. We're all seeing them. And you've mentioned that they've tested relationships between Israel and its allies. I mean, just today, 21 people killed as they waited for food. They were killed by tank and bullet fire. I mean, what people do not understand in the rest of the world is why are starving people being shot at while they're waiting for food? And this is what Israel's allies are asking.
Unfortunately, it's a tragically simple answer, and the answer is Hamas. Hamas is embedded with all these people. Hamas is trying to disrupt the distribution of food. Hamas will shoot at these people, will shoot at Palestinians. They will kidnap people who are trying to distribute food.
But Hamas doesn't have tanks.
They're under hospitals, they're under schools, they're under mosques. So, you know, if they're firing at Israel from behind the civilian population, we're going to do our best not to kill civilians, but they're going to be in there. And so Hamas bears responsibility. Let the world say the following: Hamas, surrender. Put down your guns, give out the hostages, go wherever you want to go. Israel will not follow you. You get away scot-free. And the war will end. It'll end literally in a minute. Okay? But to ask Israel all of a sudden to stop and let Hamas come out and rearm and recapture the Gaza Strip, I don't think that's a viable request for anybody to the state of Israel. I was on a European television station the other day. They asked me, okay, why don't you just stop? Why don't you just, stop, give out food, stop? I said, okay. But what's your answer for when Hamas wins and once again turns the Gaza Strip into a terror state that's going to prohibit from Israelis, hundreds of thousands of Israelis from going back to their homes? And then it's not just a tactical threat, it becomes a strategic threat. And Israel is in a very complex environment. None of this is simple. None of it is simple. It is politically, morally, very complex.
Just lastly, Ambassador, and to end this conversation on a more upbeat note, you're also quoted as saying that President Trump could go down in history as, quote, the greatest peacemaker of the 21st century. Now, you've already given me a few hints as we've gone along, but just sum up for us what that assessment is based on.
Well, I think that Lebanon has been given a glimpse of freedom that is not enjoyed in decades. Same thing true with Syria. And even in Hamas, even in Gaza, there's hope for the future that didn't exist 2 years ago. Because all of these areas were controlled to various degrees by Iran. They're all under Iran's thumb or its foot, whatever you want to, part of the body you want to put it, that they were under it. So they've been given an opportunity for freedom. And I think that many of the people in these areas will use that freedom to try to make peace. They're not going to all of a sudden turn around and make war. And I think peace between Israel and Lebanon would be extraordinary. It should be transformative for the entire Middle East, our two societies sort of pooling our resources and our talents. And with Syria, I mean, Syria has done nothing but threaten its neighbors since the 1940s. This would be a big, big difference for the entire Middle East. Peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia is not just peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it's peace between Israel and the Sunni world, or most of the Sunni world. So if Donald Trump can engineer all this, he'll get not one Nobel Prize, he'll get a whole row of Nobel Prizes, and he could be the greatest peacemaker in the 21st century. It really hangs on the balance right now. And I as an historian, I can't remember a moment like this, really, not even after the Six-Day War.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Thank you for your time, sir. That's all we've got time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye. Well, for more, we can speak now to Daniel Benaim, who is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Arabian Peninsula Affairs, who joins us from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. This ceasefire deal has been struck with the goal of ending the so-called 12-day war. How do you rate its chances?
I think there's a lot of motivation on all sides to keep the ceasefire. I think you saw some wobbles at the very outset, in part because Iran scored a pretty significant strike on Israeli civilians a few hours before the ceasefire. But you saw both parties, Iran and Israel, trying to get in the last word and then reined in by President Trump. So I think there's a pretty good chance that this ceasefire holds because I think Iran is not looking for a further fight, and Israel at this point has accomplished most of its military goals on the ground in Iran.
We heard from the US president just a short while ago before he set off for Europe for the NATO summit. I mean, he sounds like he's taking this whole situation very personally. He also sounds like he's running out of patience, using some pretty unprecedented language for a US president. Where do you think that impatience is directed, Daniel?
Well, he was pretty clear about it. He doesn't want to see either party violate the ceasefire, and he doesn't want to see Israel in particular launch a major retaliation in response to Iran's actions. He did use some colorful language, more suitable for a New York construction site maybe than the White House lawn. But his point, I think, was a valid one, which is that the two parties need to make a hard pivot from the war that they've been fighting toward upholding a ceasefire. And ultimately, I think it's in everyone's interest to see a major pivot toward diplomacy here, because there's so much that we don't know about where we are. We don't know how badly damaged the Iranian nuclear program was. We don't know what will happen to the remaining stockpiles, and we don't know whether Iran will really go to the table or try to go underground and race for a more serious nuclear program outside of international view. Now is the time to test those things and engage in real diplomacy. And the Gulf states are well positioned to be in the lead of that effort, as Qatar was in de-escalation. This is not 5 years ago. All the Gulf countries have developed détente and relations with Iran that they can use to bring life into the next phase of diplomacy in this region and further lower tensions.
I just want to pick up what you were saying there with regards to the state of the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, it doesn't sound like you're 100% sure that the United States has indeed eliminated that nuclear threat, but have they at least delayed it?
Well, presumably they've delayed it by some amount of time. I mean, they bombed most of the key sites, but whether that's a few months or several years will depend on the battle damage assessment. But honestly, more than that, a few years is a blink of an eye. So what we're really looking for here is a diplomatic solution that will take these military gains and turn them into something more lasting.
Okay, I mean, do you think that the leadership in Iran can survive in its current form? Because we've got some quite mixed messages from the Trump administration. There was talk of regime change. There was talk of how, it wasn't off the table, the idea that the supreme leader could be assassinated. And now they seem to have gone back to sort of talking about, the longer term survival of the leadership in Iran. What's your understanding of what the American sort of desired outcome is here?
Well, I think they were trying to make clear to the Iranians that they had something to lose by continuing this war. I think that was the clear message of the United States. It came out unclearly at various points, but I think that the reason that Iran signed on to the ceasefire was to ensure the survival of the regime.
Okay, and how do you rate their chances of surviving? I mean, have they been domestically weakened by what's happened, would you say? Do you think they can survive?
Well, they've lost a lot of face with their own people. They have been domestically weakened. But the question will be, who would dislodge them and in what way? And there, I think there are more questions than answers that may well keep the regime in power.
So do you think the United States has taken a decision here not to try to even serve as a catalyst to bring that about, and that if it happens because the Iranian people want it to happen? Would you say that's roughly the calculation that's been made here?
Roughly, yeah. I think they decided that wouldn't be a goal of a military operation, but something left up to the Iranian people. And if they destabilize the regime a little bit through this, and that leads in that direction, so be it. But I don't think it was a military goal. That was focused on the nuclear program.
We understand there has been contact between Washington and Tehran. It's been described as direct and indirect contact. And I just wonder whether you could sort of draw on your experience in your official capacity as US Deputy Assistant Secretary for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. What does indirect contact look like between Washington and Tehran?
Well, it has a lot of different flavors. I think when the parties are talking directly and indirectly, that's probably the most constructive, because it means that indirect is not about passing just a few messages. It's about trying to sketch out what's possible using an effective mediator. When they're not talking directly, indirect talks can be a way of buying time or conveying key messages. But to really get things done, ultimately, you need to be in direct talks. But I do think that an intermediary like Qatar or Oman, these are countries that are very good at interpreting the positions of both parties and trying to bridge them and trying to avoid potential misunderstandings. So I think using indirect diplomacy through the Gulf as a complement to direct discussions with Iran is probably the best case of all here.
Do you see a scenario in which the negotiations that were supposed to be happening a couple of weeks ago would continue? That latest round that was suspended 2 weekends ago. Do you see the process recommencing?
Yeah, I think Iran's condition to get back to the table was for Israel to stop their bombing campaign in the United States. That's now happened, so I think they do go back to the table. I think both sides have decisions to make. The United States has to decide what the United States is willing to accept in terms of from Iran and what they're willing to offer. If they're looking for an end to enrichment, what inducements are they offering to Iran? What face-saving steps are they offering? And for Iran, what are they willing to accept? There's less than zero trust, given the way that this has proceeded. But there's a lot of desperation. You may need a phased approach where something happens, some kind of freeze to allow for more diplomacy. I would look to the snapback of UN sanctions in October as an important deadline here to talk. I don't like the fact that that's only 90 days, because I think we have to get off these very tight timelines. But I do think that that's another important threshold for the success or failure of that diplomacy, when the world will decide whether to restore UN sanctions on Iran.
I mean, you mentioned Qatar just now, which just brings into the conversation last night's attack on what is the biggest US military base in the Middle East, namely in Qatar. And I'm just wondering how you interpret this chain of events, how a strike like last night's on US interests led to such a rapid de-escalation. How did that happen?
Well, I think Iran felt that they had to do something, and I think the US felt that it was likely when we struck that Iran would have to retaliate. The question was whether we could weather that retaliation. And I think that the United States probably saw Iran's telegraphing this strike, making clear to Qatar, which makes clear to us that this was coming, doing it in a way where it could be intercepted by advanced air defenses and was not in an area where there were civilians, doing it in a way that didn't cost any lives, as I think on one end of the spectrum. Look, you never want to see missiles flying across the Gulf at close US partners or US military base. But under the circumstances, this was one of the better scenarios for how this could go. And I think Qatar handled it extremely well and used the fact that this was happening to create an opportunity for diplomacy and demonstrate its value as a US partner.
So do you think that a line has now been drawn after this 12-day war? I mean, would you say this is the end of it and the beginning of a new phase, a phase of renewed diplomacy?
I think there's reason to hope that that's true and to expect that it might be true. I think Israel accomplished its military objectives. The United States achieved a denouement that we could live with and weathered Iranian retaliation. Iran is badly weakened and not looking for a fight in the near term, although I suspect over time they'll look for other ways to find revenge. The question is, having done this, whether we can meaningfully improve on the diplomacy that was available before this war to achieve something enduring on the ground. Because I think that without that, it's a matter of time before either you have more conflict or Iran is rebuilding and potentially reconstituting the very threats that this war sought to stop. So what comes now is all important to the success of what's happened over these last 12 days.
and clearly having been compromised in terms of their intel to the extent that they have been, mostly by Israel. I mean, Iran will have to think very carefully, won't it, about even thinking about breathing new life into that nuclear program?
I think that's true. But we've also seen Iran make a series of calculations since October 7th and really for 46 years that would suggest that they view things differently and have a narrative, strategic narrative of resistance and defiance. Another country might conclude that the only thing that would have kept them safe, like North Korea, would have been to have a nuclear weapon this whole time and to race for a bomb rather than to sit at the threshold and see if they could get across it. You know, Ayatollah Khomeini said, "We didn't conduct this revolution to affect the price of watermelons." I think there's an ideological component here, an anti-Western component, a religious component, a nationalist component that are incredibly important. And it's important to the regime to look strong in front of its people. So I wouldn't discount those elements in assessing the calculus of the regime, whereas we might make a different one. But I do think that there is an opportunity for diplomacy here. And it's very important that all countries work together to try to turn a corner and convert what's happened militarily, whether we supported it or not, into something much more useful and a more peaceful Middle East.
So a very basic question. Who, in your opinion, emerges from all of this as the victor?
I think Israel has shown its military capability and intel capability backed by the United States and emerged as a kind of regional heavyweight through this action and a series of actions over the last several months that showed that it had not only the capability, but the will to go after countries that were targeting it. I think the United States showed that they remain an indispensable regional broker. And I think that, frankly, Qatar, in weathering this attack and turning it so quickly into a useful end to this war, showed itself to be a very capable and useful regional player. And I think the other regional states also played an important role in getting us here. I think Iran is badly weakened. But for Iran, it will declare victory in resisting Israel and the United States and surviving to fight another day and try to rely on its propaganda to convince its own people of that, most of whom would be happy to see the government gone.
Sure. I mean, just lastly, I mean, how do you think Iran is adapting to dealing with the Trump administration versus the Biden administration before that? I mean, President Trump's choices of words, his methodology, his comms, the timing of his actions. I mean, he has shown himself, hasn't he, the last couple of days to be the master of surprise, even to people in his inner sanctum.
Yeah, I think surprise cuts two ways. It's useful on the battlefield, and it's a bit harder in diplomacy because it means you can't really position yourself to go in a certain direction. And I think that the drawbacks of that surprise will be evident when we try to convert into a diplomatic picture here. The fact that 2 rounds of diplomacy were a prelude to strikes means that Iran will be looking over its shoulder in ways that may make it harder for it to take some risks. But I think that Trump has a unique role in this because he is the one who destroyed this deal, which incidentally was working at the time about 7 years ago. That gives him a unique ability to reconstitute a nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran and bring along the parties that were opposed to the last one, or at least some of them. So I do think he has leverage. And the question is, how does he take that leverage and gain sufficient trust to, in a relationship that has zero trust in both directions, really, to achieve something meaningful politically and strategically out of the military steps that it's taken? Because the military can do a lot to change the picture. But the most enduring solutions, I think, here, when it comes to the resolution of Iran's nuclear program, will involve diplomacy backed by the military.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Daniel Benaim, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Philip Breedlove, who is the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and former Vice Chief of Staff of the US Air Force. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. Let me just start by asking you a basic question. Is this the end of the so-called 12-day war, in your opinion?
Well, I think that's hard to tell. Clearly, the U.S. president is trying to make it the end of the war. What we have to see now is, are both of the protagonists going to accept that status? We can only hope.
Okay, I mean, who do you think can be declaring victory at any rate?
Wow. I don't think declaring victory is very responsible. Here's how I would describe it. I think that Israel has accomplished most of its goals, and that is good for much of the world, that Iran not become a nuclear nation. So the world wins in that this program may be truncated and or slowed down significantly. But I think that Iran, of course, has suffered huge damage, but they are still intact as a theocracy. And so I'm not sure how the world is going to measure that.
Okay, clearly Operation Midnight Hammer at the weekend was a decisive moment in this 12-day war, perhaps the most decisive moment. I don't know what you think. We think destroying 3 of Iran's nuclear sites. I mean, do you buy into the fact that, as the Trump administration said, Iran's nuclear capability has been essentially obliterated, to use their choice of words?
I'm not going to enter into what I would call a very political point. Let's just say this. The Israeli Air Force, over a matter of days, have established air supremacy over Iran. And their air forces were systematically destroying Iranian military capabilities. But Israel was incapable of doing a few things that the United States could do. And so this operation was incredible. This is what I did for 2/3 of my military career. I was a fighter pilot, and putting together this kind of operation, the immense coordination issues between all involved is incredibly difficult. And what you saw is the United States joint force pulling off, primarily via the U.S. Air Force and its bombers, but it was a joint effort, and they pulled off an incredibly well-flown, well-executed, well-planned mission that, for all intents and purposes, should have an incredible effect on the target set. Now, as to exactly what happened to that target set, there will be more analysis done, but the fact of the matter is, because it was weaponeered well and everything went according to plan, we can expect that a lot of damage was done.
Yeah, we were talking to a former Top Gun fighter pilot yesterday who talked us through some of the logistics of an operation like Operation Midnight Hammer, which sounds like one of the most extraordinarily complex and well-coordinated military shows we've seen in many years. What do you think that operation says to the world about U.S. military capabilities?
Well, it says a lot of things. First of all, a lot of people have questioned American resolve. I mean, we have people continually asking, why has America done nothing about Russia running amok in the European land spaces with its army? And so there has been those that have questioned America's resolve and will to do what it needs to do. Well, this was a big message. The President of the United States tried to effect peace. He gave the protagonists time to effect that peace, and Iran chose not to cooperate with that plan. And so the President of the United States did what he said he was going to do, and he did it decisively. And the way he did it, only the United States of America can pull that off.
Yeah, and he did something else as well, didn't he? Because he sort of gave the world and Iran a sort of a slight sort of sense of false security, that there were going to be 2 weeks of thinking and then action would be taken. And in fact, it was only 2 days after he said he was going to think about it for 2 weeks or less than, that action actually was taken. And I just want to ask you about that element of surprise and how big of a part did that play?
Yeah, we don't call it surprise, we call it deception. You know, today, in today's world, the whole, and I'm not picking on you, but the whole press thing is to figure out what America is doing and then out it, get it out there for everybody to see and hear about. I mean, how many times have you heard the press talk about Israel having to do a ground assault on photo? You know, there is no surprise when the 24-hour news cycle is talking about what you want to do over and over and over and over. Everybody gets ready. And so I think what you saw here, it was an incredible deception campaign, including the rerouting of some airplanes in the air and the arrival of TLAMs launched from the sea. All of this generated an element of surprise, and the package was not engaged on the way in or the way out. And those aviators did a magnificent job, and the deception plan was a big part of their ability to do that incredible job.
Sure, I mean, took us all by surprise, that's for certain. And let's just say, I mean, even yesterday, there were fears of escalation towards a global conflict. And yet today, I mean, the world seems, you know, a very different place. I mean, a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. But would you say the fears of escalation towards a much broader conflict have now subsided, at least to some extent?
I do believe they have subsided. I think that Iran has made some prudent choices on how they responded and what they're doing. Well, and let's just ask ourselves why. Israel has established air superiority over Iran and was flying without hindrance and attacking systematically the military of Iran. It was also, of course, attacking the nuclear forces, but it was beginning to take apart Iran's ability to fight, and Iran has been able to do nothing about it. The Russian equipment in there was destroyed or thwarted, and Israel has won air superiority over the enemy's ground spaces and was defeating him in detail. I think that Iran made a prudent choice to decide to stop before they lost so much more of their military capability.
They stopped, and yet they fired 14 ballistic missiles at the US base in Al Udeid, which is in Qatar. I mean,
and
no damage. What was it?
Well, and they basically told us it was coming, and they said it was going to be proportional, and they fired a proportional volley, of which 13 of the 14 were shot down. The 14th one was determined to be landing in a place that would have no effect. And so I think that, again, this was almost a message of, listen, we have an internal audience we have to deal with. We're going to fire back. It's coming, et cetera, et cetera. And the whole way that was orchestrated, to me, is an Iran who's made a prudent decision that maybe it's time to stop this.
Does it show that we're talking here about a significantly weakened Iran?
Well, clearly, all you have to do is watch the tapes that are even showing on TV, and those are probably a minuscule amount of the tapes that are available to the military analysts. But Israel was beginning to systematically eliminate the surface-to-air threat, the surface-to-surface threat, airplanes. All of these elements of Iranian power were being systematically eliminated.
There was talk not so long ago, although it feels like a very long time ago, about regime change. There was the mention that assassination of the top leader in Iran was not off the table. I don't know if you think it was ever really on the table, but how vulnerable do you think the Iranian leadership looks right now?
Well, I don't have to comment. All you have to do is look at the record of the last 3 or 4 or 5 days of what Israel has done to the leadership of the military and the leadership of the nuclear program. It is very clear that they can reach out and touch these leaders.
Do you think they'll survive?
I don't want to make that judgment. I think that that the world now is going to watch how Iran comports itself, what it does, what it says, etc. And also, you can bet that the U.S. president, if you've watched him in the last several hours, he's watching Israel as to what they're going to do. And there is an expectation that we now find a more peaceful way forward.
It was risky, wasn't it, politically, for President Trump to get involved at all. There were many in the GOP, or some in the ranks of the GOP, who didn't want him to get involved, and he did, and he's done it in a measured way. Would you say, up until this point, what we've seen is vindication for the president's calculations?
Again, I wouldn't use that word. Here's what I would say. Every president that I can remember has done what this president did and used force to affect a battlefield or an important situation. Yes, you have it exactly right. There was a lot of pressure on this president to maybe not do what he did. He ran on not starting wars. And yes, you have it right again. The president sent a very measured response. I mean, there's only one nation in the world that can do what the United States did with those B-2s and with the MOPS and with all the other supporting cast of characters, to include what Israel did to establish air superiority over Iran. All of these things had to be calculated and looked at, and the president made a decision to move forward with a limited reply and send, I think, quite a message, don't you?
Absolutely. And I want to ask you as well about how, there was concern, especially by those people who were against any kind of US involvement, that it was going to draw in other players, that somehow Iran's allies would come to its rescue. That didn't happen. What does that say to us?
Well, I think that those other players, most notably China and Russia, did not want to be associated with what was about to happen to Iran. And I think they knew that they could do all manner of trying to help them in the short term, and the result would have been the same, and they didn't want to associate themselves with a demonstrative result. And so they have kept themselves back. Additionally, as you know, there are some of those nations have a lot of equipment inside Iran that have been systematically thwarted and eliminated by Israel's attacks. And I don't think they want to continue to advertise to the world that their kit performed the way it did.
Do you think that perhaps it would be too hasty to say that there are a few paper tigers out there?
I'm not going to let you put those words in my mouth. There is nothing paper tiger about our superpower enemies in this world. And what we need to do is understand that they are enemies and treat them so. We seem to have some confusion about what Russia is. And Russia is carrying on a theater-level war in Europe. And we have yet to really recognize that Mr. Putin is not an ally. He is not a partner. He is a war criminal and an enemy.
This conflict, which lasted 12 days, and as we've been saying, as we've been agreeing throughout this conversation, the pace of change has been remarkable, especially in the last couple of days. What struck you most about these 12 days, and what have we learned from this?
Well, I'm not sure it's the subject you want to talk about, but you asked the question. There is this view in the world that what is happening in Ukraine is the future of warfare. And the failure of air power in Ukraine has resulted in a drone war and a reversion to World War I attrition, artillery base, grinding, ugly, uneducated warfare. And what people were beginning to believe is that's what warfare looks like. And what you have seen now in Iran is what happens when a modern, capable air force is turned loose on an opponent. Israel went in and established air superiority over Iran, and then began to exploit that air superiority in disassembling the Iranian military. And that, my friend, is the future of warfare.
Well, General Breedlove, that is something I wanted to ask you about, because, of course, you're the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and President Trump, we saw him boarding the flight for Europe just a couple of hours ago, heading to a NATO summit. 32 countries there assembling in the Netherlands. How united is that alliance looking at this particular moment, and what do you expect to come out of this summit?
Well, my hat's off to the new Secretary General Rutte, because we expect that we'll have 31 out of 32 nations who are ready to adopt what the U.S. president is asking for as far as investments. And so that itself is an amazing feat. Only one country appears to be holding out against that plan, but the fact that 31 of 32 are ready to move forward, that's a good thing. And, we all, including the United States of America, spent almost 3 decades trying to, what I call, hug the bear, make a partner out of Russia, get Russia to become more Western in its approach to world affairs. And we were all fooled. What we now understand, and what NATO finally has adopted and written into all of their plans and documents, is Russia is an enemy. They are not a partner. They are not going to be an ally. They are not going to move forward for peace. Since 2008, Russia has amassed its army, marched across internationally recognized borders, and invaded its neighbors 4 times. And we now in the West have got to deal with the fact that Russia is run by a war criminal and a person that has no intention of peace in Europe.
Okay, and just lastly, and sort of to go full circle, to what extent would you say the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, in which the United States participated in a decisive and meaningful way, in what way does all of that, do you think, if at all, set the scene for that summit at The Hague?
Well, I think one of the most important things I would take away is that the American president has said what he was going to do. He gave Iran a long period to find a peaceful way ahead, and Iran chose not to cooperate. And in the end, the President of the United States did exactly what he said he was going to do. I think that in NATO, it shows some resolve. People have questioned, because of some of the quote unquote mean tweets and things, people have questioned America's resolve and America's will. And we have been extremely slow to show that will in the face of Russian aggression and non-cooperation in all the peace processes, etc. And I think that the people of NATO will take some solace in the fact that when and if Mr. Putin crosses that line one too many times, America knows what to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. A real pleasure talking to you. Really appreciate it. General Philip Breedlove, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.